Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Under the Macroscope, in which we welcome back Skybound Capital's Chief Strategist in the London office, Javier Sadawala, who is going to be talking about his top 5 investment trends for 2022. And Javier has always been very thematic in his view, so this really does fit the title of the podcast, Under the Macroscope, because we really are going with 5 very macro themes, which in the course of time we'll drill down into in some more detail. And unsurprisingly, given a number of the conversations we've had in recent times, Javier, we're going to start with number 1, inflation.
That's correct, yeah. So good morning, man. Absolutely, I think that this is the most current theme of the lot. And whilst the debate still rages about whether it's transitory or more structural, in fact, really, I should say transitory for longer now, if that's the latest terminology. There are more and more people coming out and saying that this has got some legs to it. The point I'd like to make with inflation now is that so far it's been primarily driven by energy, and there's still more to come. I mean, it was expected that the energy portion of inflation would die away some months ago. Well, it hasn't. We've actually seen one form of energy take over from another. It started with oil, and then after oil, it then started to get into natural gas, and we saw triple-digit increases there. So it hasn't gone away, and I think there's more to come. And God help us if we have a severe winter. The other point to note is that there are two also critical components. The first is what's known as shelter. So this is housing-related costs. It's often overlooked that the impact of housing has quite a long lag time. So it can be anywhere between 12 and 18 months. So actually, we haven't even seen the effects of that come through yet. Potentially, we've still got another 6 months to wait before that happens. So even if energy suddenly flatlined from these levels, it doesn't mean it's all fine, it's all hunky-dory. In fact, there's another blow coming from higher rental costs. And then with regards to wages, it's often been said that, particularly for instance by the Australian Central Bank, that so far the wage increases are relatively modest, and that they don't feel that this is going to maintain inflation going forward. The problem is wages tends to be the last cog in the wheel. People weigh up the impacts of everything that I've just spoken about, plus a lot more, because the inflation basket comprises all sorts of things. Let's not forget food prices. And then that's when wage inflation comes through. Why I believe it's different this time is because there is genuinely an acute shortage of labor, of people in the market. And actually, you have to look back to the 1960s to see strong similarities. In the UK, I remember that's when we had a big wave of immigration into the country from the Commonwealth, because there were shortages in the National Health Service and the transport system. In a way, that's what we're looking at now. We have an acute shortage. So the leverage, the bargaining power, rests very much with employees. So the important thing to note here is that it's not going to go away. And from an asset allocation point of view, people have to think about this very carefully going forward. We are already on some rather significant inflation numbers.
And we've got some milestones on the horizon to look out for in that regard as well, which we will keep listeners to the podcast updated on. One in particular around the 13th of December, when you expect US inflation numbers to come out and the knock-on effects of that. So something to keep an eye on there. I'm going to move on to your next trend, and that's really what you've described as world lines being redrawn. This one sounds interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at most of the rhetoric we've had so far, people love to generalize. That's the kind of world we live in. And the longer the time period that passes by, the more easily people tend to exaggerate and just create a headline out of nothing. the world lines, I don't think is just about the US versus China. I really don't. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. So I've always believed history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And if you look at the three components here, well, we've just had the COP26 summit, as you'll be familiar with. You were in Scotland for a part of that. I think we're seeing new lines evolve and develop around the ESG thing, actually ESGI, if you take impact as well. There are going to be those countries that conform around ESG, and there are those that don't, and we've seen this in the summit. The don't brigade comprise the usual suspects: India, China, Russia, and a few others. And the do brigade, the ones who want to effect change, granted from a position of luxury, because they've already had the benefits of coal plants and so on from the past, primarily the Western, the developed economies. So how is this going to be pursued going forward? Does this mean potentially sanctions on goods being imported from countries that don't conform? This is a wonderful opportunity for politicians to do so if they ever wanted to go down that Cold War phenomenon. This is one, and that has direct implications in terms of trade. The second, which is growing more and more silently, is around the Belts and Road Initiative, the BRI for short, that China's been pursuing for some time. Some might liken it to the concept of the axis of evil. Depends really what side of the fence you're on. So this is being pursued. China is growing impatient with certain countries. There was a situation, the headline just recently, that they've been pressuring Kenya to hurry up with its route, and they've now actually just got people clearing the ways in the Masai Mara to put some life back into some old rail tracks, so as to complete the project there. So that's a critical one. I think that's defining a new axis. We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan lately with the new government, which is really in tatters from a monetary point of view. And then the third area around what new world lines will, to me, what is ultimately the next world war. It's not physical, it's not arms and battle. It's all about monetary and digital. The dollar has been king for goodness knows how long. Today, some 3/4 of all currency exchange is done in the US dollar, followed by the euro, which is the next big one, and then sterling, and then the renminbi is 4th or 5th down the list. And what we've seen are initiatives by the central banks of many of these countries to develop their own digital FX. That's what they are doing. And it will all be consolidated around their central banks. So essentially, it's a blockchain approach, but it just becomes all digital. That's what I think that's what they're aiming at. And that combination of monetary and digital is what will define the ultimate winner. So it's whoever can progress quickly enough and dominate quickly enough. That's really what it's all about.
Which moves seamlessly into the next theme, actually, which is around technology. And we've seen the acceleration of a number of technology-focused businesses and economies out of necessity during COVID. But this is a trend for 2022 that you expect to accelerate even further.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. It's not going to die. I think it's actually, in a way, it's almost like technology is becoming a consumer staple or a staple type play. Now, look, I mean, when we have sell-offs, technology sector will get hit hard as well. I mean, there are very few things that are exempt from that kind of situation. But in terms of what has longevity, technology now more than ever before has real longevity to it. It's got legs. So if you look at the different components, first of all, I just mentioned about digital FX. So there's that side of it, the innovation. I think one area which is happening every day, and perhaps we're not so cognizant of it, maybe we've become used to it, But control, control by governments is taking place at a faster and faster rate. The ability of governments to monitor what individuals do. There's information out there on all of us. The ability to aggregate this data and use it to advantage is critical. So, things like artificial intelligence will definitely, particularly from a security and defense point of view, will be really important. The ability to identify an individual, whether it's at an airport or out in the public, that's just so important. I mean, already huge strides have been made. I mentioned earlier in the inflation side and the labor shortages, automation now, robotics, for instance, will continue to excel, because ultimately that's going to be the answer. But you can't do that overnight. These things, it takes 2 to 3 years just to build a plant that can spit out robots. So this is a 3 to 5 year time. And that, if anything, is when inflation maybe will start to ebb away. But the last one is security. Whether it's on our individual devices, the world of hacking will carry on. That war between Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty will just it's a game of one-upmanship. It's just going to go on. And the ability to outsmart the other is, security is absolutely critical. So unless you're willing to just switch off your Wi-Fi when you leave home, then you've got no choice. You're going to have to download security software.
So technology was a theme that was accelerated during COVID and will continue. Another one of those, which is your fourth out of five, should I say, is healthcare and the ongoing challenges. And this is not restricted to so-called poorer countries.
No, absolutely. And, what a day to be having this podcast. I mean, we've just heard today, or technically yesterday, about how flights have now been stopped from South Africa or certain Southern African nations with the potential of this new variant that's now emerged. It should be apparent to everybody that this whole COVID issue, this whole virus issue, whether it morphs from COVID into something else, is not going to go away. This has changed the way science now moves forward. There's going to be a lot invested in new technologies around this. And it won't just be vaccine production as well. It's what goes on around that. It's the testing and the decoding. Whilst testing has come a long way, we know it's not perfect. You have lateral flow tests, then you have PCR tests. Sometimes they're wrong, then you have to do it again. It's tedious. I think the ability to do something quickly is really what's going to be the defining characteristic. Also around that, let's not forget things like oral treatments. I mean, it's one thing having injections all the time, but if you can just slip a pill, that would be very convenient. So I think there'll be a lot of development in that arena. I know one of the big drug companies is trying, it's just awaiting approval on this. I forget who it is. And then around that, also linked to healthcare, but now moving away from viruses generally, healthcare budgets are huge. In America, it's well over $1 trillion per annum. And when you look at the common ailments, for instance, you do get things like obesity-related illnesses. So I think more and more emphasis on screening and prevention, and also around aging. People are living longer. So if you want a quality lifestyle, you've got to find a way of beating those back pains and all those other things. This is just reality. That's why often when I look at themes, particularly healthcare, they get too convoluted for my liking. They get far too technical. Let's just keep it simple. I think these are the real things that we're going to see develop. So.
And in your second theme around sort of the redrawing of world lines, ESG was mentioned as a sort of sub-subject, if I can call it that. But your fifth theme is around the pure green economy. And which may or may not have universal buy-in, but regardless of that, is a reality and a strong reality in the next couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. And, we did a podcast on this a couple of weeks ago, linked to this. I think given the urgency of the nature, and this was actually following the COP summit as well, the reality is right now, we are not heading for our 1.5 degree target. We're just not. Scientists have said at best, it's going to be 1.8. And at worst, God help us, it's going to be 2.4. Look at the damage that 1.5 is doing right now. So anything more than that is unthinkable. So in terms of the green economy, I think the winners are going to be things, for instance, like carbon capture. I've had some on-running debates on the likes of LinkedIn and so on with individuals. But we're not going to suddenly stop tree felling overnight, even if we could, that would be fabulous, because that would actually bring us back into the targets pretty damn quickly. We're not going to do that. We're not going to get rid of coal overnight. And to an extent, emerging markets have got a point. They've got a big population to look after. So the solution also has to be on ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So I think technologies that do that, whether it's sticking something on the end of an exhaust pipe or huge filters on coal-powered fire stations, or plants that literally remove carbon, that's where the focus is going to be. There's an urgency. There's a real urgency. Otherwise, we are headed to miss our targets. It's as simple as that. And around that also sustainability. We've got to think about more sustainable agriculture, because that's another big emitter in the atmosphere. So we have to change our ways.
And Jabir, these 5 are all intertwined in their own different ways, aren't they?
They are, absolutely. There's a bridge from one into the other. They are all linked. I mean, you could argue that they're just born out of the same thing. But I think for me, these are the current themes and problems that we face. And over the next certainly 12 months and 24 months, 36 even, this is what we're going to be facing.
So there you have it, Chief Strategist for Skybound Capital, Jabir Sadawala. He's given his 5 key themes going into 2022 and how they're interlinked. And as I mentioned at the front end of the podcast, we look forward to investigating all of these a little more deeply and giving you some more detail on them. But just to recap, the ever-present topic of inflation, the redrawing of world lines, technology, healthcare, and the pure green economy. Those are the 5 key things. And of course, all the underlying related issues, but those are our 5 key macro themes to keep an eye on in the investment universe in 2022. Jabir, as always, great getting your views, and do look forward to exploring those with you in more detail as we get into 2022. And as I mentioned earlier, keeping an eye on December 13. That's the date that Jabir told me to put in my diary for the release of US inflation data. Don't forget, you can download the podcast Under the Macroscope on Apple, Spotify, and also the Google podcast platform for Android. And this and all the other editions of Under the Macroscope are available at www.skyboundcapital.com. Until next time on Under the Macroscope, have a great week.